Before we talk about obsession, revenge, or toxic love, we need to talk about time. Because Wuthering Heights did not come out of nowhere. It was published in 1847 during the Victorian era, a period famous for strict rules, rigid morality, and emotional restraint. And that's exactly why this novel feels so shocking even today. This is Curly Curl, your guide to pop culture explained. Subscribe for film breakdowns, trend analysis, and all things pop culture. Victorian England was a society obsessed with appearances. People were expected to be polite, controlled, religious, and respectable at all times. Emotions, especially intense ones like rage, desire, or jealousy, were supposed to be hidden. Love was not about passion, it was about stability, class, and reputation. Marriage was often a business arrangement, not a romantic choice. Who you married could determine your social survival. And class mattered everything. You were born into a social position, and escaping it was almost impossible. The rich stayed rich, the poor stayed poor, and crossing that boundary came with consequences. This is crucial for understanding Wuthering Heights because nearly every conflict in the novel is rooted in class tension, exclusion, and social judgment. Now let's talk about Emily Brontë because she didn't fit neatly into this world either. She lived a quiet, isolated life far from London's literary scene. She wasn't a socialite, she wasn't married, and she didn't follow the expectations placed on women at the time. Women were supposed to write gentle novels about manners and romance if they wrote at all. Instead, Emily Brontë wrote a story full of cruelty, obsession, emotional violence, and moral ambiguity. So when Wuthering Heights was published, readers were disturbed. Critics didn't just dislike it, they were offended. They called it savage, immoral, and unnatural. Not because it was poorly written, but because it refused to behave. The characters are not polite, the love is not healthy, and the story doesn't teach you how to be good. This is where the Victorian context matters most. In a society that valued control, Wuthering Heights is about emotional excess. In a culture that worshipped order, this novel thrives on chaos. And in a time when women were expected to be passive and gentle, Emily Brontë gave us characters, especially Catherine, who are loud, angry, selfish, and unapologetically emotional. The novel also belongs to the Gothic tradition, which was popular during this period but still controversial. Gothic literature explored the darker side of human nature, madness, obsession, isolation, and the supernatural. It wasn't meant to comfort the reader. It was meant to unsettle them. And Wuthering Heights does exactly that, using nature, isolation, and emotional extremity to expose what Victorian society tried so hard to hide. What makes this even more powerful is that the violence in the novel isn't just physical, it's emotional. People hurt each other through control, rejection, silence, and social power. These were very real forces in Victorian life, especially for women and outsiders. The novel doesn't exaggerate them, it reveals them. So when we read Wuthering Heights, we're not just reading a love story, we're reading a rebellion. A challenge to the idea that emotions can be controlled, that love can be contained, and that society's rules can protect people from pain. Emily Brontë shows us what happens when a society represses feeling for too long. It explodes. Understanding this historical moment helps us see why Wuthering Heights feels so intense, so uncomfortable, and so unforgettable. It wasn't just shocking because of what it said, but because of when it dared to say it. And this context is only the beginning. Because once we step into the world of the moors, the houses, and the characters themselves, the darkness goes even deeper. Once we move past the historical moment, Wuthering Heights becomes less about society and more about atmosphere. This is where the novel fully enters the world of the Gothic, not with castles or monsters, but with emotion, isolation, and psychological darkness. The Gothic in Wuthering Heights isn't decorative. It's not there to look spooky. It's there to make you uncomfortable. The novel creates a sense of unease by trapping its characters in remote spaces, cutting them off from the outside world, and forcing them to live inside their own emotions with no escape. Isolation isn't just a setting here, it's a condition of the soul. One of the most powerful Gothic elements in the novel is the way nature reflects emotion. The weather is rarely calm. The wind howls, storms rage, and the landscape feels hostile. These aren't background details. They echo the inner lives of the characters, especially when emotions become too intense to control. When feelings spiral into rage, jealousy, or obsession, the environment seems to react. The supernatural also plays a subtle but crucial role. Ghosts in Wuthering Heights are not jump scares, they are unresolved emotions. Catherine's presence after death isn't about fear, it's about refusal. Refusal to let go, to be separated, to accept the limits of the physical world. The Gothic allows the novel to blur the line between life and death, suggesting that certain emotions are too powerful to stay buried. Another key Gothic feature is the absence of moral safety. There is no guiding voice telling us who is right or wrong. The narrator doesn't rescue us. We're left alone with cruelty, manipulation, and emotional violence, forced to witness without judgment. This creates discomfort, but it also creates honesty. People are not punished neatly for their sins, and suffering doesn't lead to wisdom. Darkness in this novel is psychological. Love is not gentle. Grief becomes obsessive. Desire turns destructive. The Gothic form gives Emily Brontë permission to explore emotions at their most extreme, without softening them, without explaining them away. The result is a story that feels raw and almost intrusive, as if we're witnessing something private and dangerous. What makes this especially effective is that the Gothic elements are grounded in realism. There are no elaborate fantasies, no mythical creatures. Everything terrifying in Wuthering Heights comes from human behavior, how people love, how they resent, how they refuse to heal. The horror is emotional, not imaginary. By using the Gothic mode, the novel exposes what polite society avoids: emotional excess, unresolved trauma, and the long shadow of obsession. It doesn't offer comfort or closure. It immerses the reader in intensity and lets them sit with it. This is why Wuthering Heights feels less like a story you observe and more like an experience you endure. The Gothic doesn't just shape the novel's mood, it shapes how the story breathes, how it suffocates, and how it refuses to let the reader remain distant. And once that atmosphere is established, the setting itself becomes impossible to ignore. Because in Wuthering Heights, places are not passive, they are alive, symbolic, and deeply tied to the fate of everyone inside them. Once the Gothic atmosphere settles in, the setting itself becomes one of the most powerful forces in Wuthering Heights. This is a novel where places don't just host events, they shape them. The landscape, the houses, even the air seem to push the characters towards certain choices, as if escape were never really possible. At the center of this world are two houses, and they could not be more different. Wuthering Heights stands exposed to constant wind and storms. Nothing shields it. The name itself suggests unrest, turbulence, and resistance. Life there is harsh, loud, and emotionally raw. People argue, dominate, suffer, and love without restraint. This house doesn't encourage reflection or growth, it amplifies instinct. Thrushcross Grange, on the other hand, is protected, elegant, and controlled. It represents comfort, order, and social approval. Emotions here are softened, disciplined, and made acceptable. But that safety comes at a cost. Passion is replaced with politeness, and intensity is traded for stability. The Grange offers protection, but it also suffocates. The tension between these two houses mirrors the central conflict of the novel. One stands for wild emotion and authenticity, the other for social conformity and restraint. Characters are constantly pulled between them, and every time they move from one space to the other, something changes, not just in their circumstances, but in who they are allowed to be. Beyond the houses lies the moors, stretching endlessly between and beyond them. The moors are not owned, not tamed, and not controlled by social rules. They represent freedom, but also danger. When characters are on the moors, they are closest to their true selves. There are no walls, no class distinctions, no observers, only exposure. Yet this freedom is not gentle. The moors are harsh, unpredictable, and isolating. They offer emotional truth, but no protection. In this landscape, feelings cannot be hidden or managed. They exist fully, violently, and without apology. The characters who belong to the moors struggle to survive anywhere else. What's important is that the novel never presents one space as completely good or evil. Wuthering Heights breeds cruelty but also authenticity. Thrushcross Grange offers safety but demands emotional sacrifice. The moors promise freedom but deliver loneliness. Every space takes something in exchange for what it gives. This is why movement in the novel is never neutral. When characters leave one place for another, they don't just change location, they change identity. The setting becomes a silent judge, rewarding conformity and punishing emotional excess, or exposing raw truth at the cost of comfort. Emily Brontë uses space to show that environment shapes destiny. The characters don't simply make choices in these places, they are shaped by them, limited by them, and sometimes destroyed by them. The settings lock people into patterns that feel inherited, inevitable, and nearly impossible to escape. By the time we understand the symbolic weight of the houses and the moors, it becomes clear that this story is not just about individuals. It's about forces, emotional, social, and environmental, working together to trap people in cycles of passion and pain. And within these spaces, the characters begin to emerge not just as individuals, but as products of where they live, what they're denied, and what they cannot let go of. Which brings us directly to the people themselves and the emotional damage they carry. Once the environment of Wuthering Heights is established, the characters begin to feel less like individuals and more like emotional forces colliding. These are not people we are meant to admire or imitate. They are people we are meant to observe, often uncomfortably, as they act out their deepest wounds. At the center of the novel is Heathcliff, a character defined by exclusion. From the moment he enters the story, he is marked as an outsider socially, emotionally, and even linguistically. He grows up unloved, humiliated, and constantly reminded that he does not belong. This early rejection shapes everything he becomes. Love for Heathcliff is never safe. It is absolute, possessive, and inseparable from pain. When that love is denied, it hardens into revenge. His cruelty is not random, it is deliberate, patient, and emotionally calculated. Heathcliff doesn't seek happiness, he seeks symmetry. If he suffered, others must suffer too. Opposite him stands Catherine Earnshaw, a character driven by contradiction. She is fiercely emotional, impulsive, and self-aware, yet unable to act on that awareness. Catherine understands that her bond with Heathcliff is deep and essential, but she also understands the social cost of choosing him. Rather than resolve this conflict, she attempts to live in both worlds at once. She wants emotional freedom without social consequence, passion without sacrifice. This refusal to choose fractures her identity. Her famous declaration that she is Heathcliff is not romantic. It is a confession of emotional dependence so complete that separation becomes annihilation. Their relationship is not built on mutual care, but on recognition. They see themselves reflected in each other's wildness, and that recognition feels irreplaceable. But recognition without empathy becomes destructive. Neither truly protects the other. Instead, they use love as a mirror, not a shelter. The result is a bond that consumes rather than sustains. Around them, the secondary characters act as emotional contrasts rather than fully independent agents. Edgar Linton represents restraint, security, and social approval. He offers comfort but not understanding. His love is conditional on calmness and control, which Catherine cannot maintain. Isabella represents romantic illusion, drawn to intensity without understanding its violence. Her suffering exposes how easily passion can disguise abuse. The younger generation shifts the pattern slightly. Characters like Hareton and Cathy inherit the damage of the past, but not its intensity. Their story suggests that cycles of cruelty are learned, not inevitable. Where the older generation clings to obsession, the younger one moves, slowly and imperfectly, toward connection and repair. What makes these characters so unsettling is that none of them are morally safe. The novel refuses to divide people into heroes and villains. Pain does not justify cruelty, but cruelty is shown to grow out of pain. This moral ambiguity forces the reader to sit with discomfort rather than judgment. In Wuthering Heights, character is not destiny, trauma is. Love does not heal by default. Without self-knowledge and restraint, it becomes another form of violence. The people in this story are not destroyed because they feel too much, but because they never learn how to live with what they feel. And this brings us to the central question that haunts the novel, whether what binds these characters together is love at all, or something far more dangerous. By the time we reach the heart of Wuthering Heights, one question refuses to disappear. Is this love, or is it obsession wearing the mask of love? The novel forces us to confront how easily intense emotion can be mistaken for devotion, and how destructive that mistake can be. The bond between Catherine and Heathcliff is often described as passionate, eternal, even transcendent. But when we look closely, what defines it is not care, growth, or mutual protection. It is possession. Each sees the other not as a separate person, but as something essential to their own existence. This kind of attachment leaves no room for boundaries. Separation feels like death, not because love has ended, but because identity itself has collapsed. Love, at its healthiest, allows for difference. Obsession cannot tolerate it. In Wuthering Heights, difference is treated as betrayal. Catherine's attempt to exist in a socially acceptable world is experienced by Heathcliff as annihilation. Heathcliff's refusal to evolve or forgive traps Catherine in emotional paralysis. Neither can accept change in the other, because change threatens the fantasy of unity they depend on. What makes this dynamic especially dangerous is that it feels meaningful. The intensity convinces them, and often readers, that something profound must be at work. But intensity is not proof of love. Pain is not evidence of depth. The novel repeatedly shows that suffering can bond people just as powerfully as care, and far more destructively. Revenge becomes the clearest sign that love has crossed into obsession. Heathcliff's actions after Catherine's death are not expressions of grief that seeks healing. They are attempts to preserve pain, to keep emotional wounds open so that connection, however distorted, never ends. He would rather haunt and be haunted than let go. In this world, moving on is treated as a betrayal of feeling. The novel also exposes how obsession isolates. Characters consumed by it lose the ability to empathize with others. Children become tools, marriages become weapons, and relationships become strategies. Love narrows instead of expands. It stops being about connection and becomes about control. What's striking is that Wuthering Heights never condemns this explicitly. There is no authorial voice stepping in to explain the lesson. Instead, the novel lets obsession exhaust itself. It burns through generations, leaving damage in its wake until it finally loses its force. Only then does something quieter, less dramatic, and less intoxicating begin to emerge. This contrast is crucial. The love that survives in the novel is not loud, it is not consuming, it does not demand annihilation of the self. It is imperfect, slower, and far less romantic by traditional standards, but it allows life to continue. In comparison, obsession is revealed as sterile. It produces intensity but no future. By refusing to glamorize this distinction, Wuthering Heights challenges one of literature's most dangerous myths, that love must hurt to be real. The novel suggests the opposite, that love which cannot tolerate growth, separation, or change is not tragic, it is destructive. And this is why the story continues to disturb readers. It doesn't offer a beautiful, redeeming vision of passion. It offers a warning, one that asks us to question not only these characters but the way we define love itself. And once we confront that question, we're forced to ask another. Why did this story provoke such outrage when it was first published? And why Wuthering Heights was first published? It didn't just confuse readers, it disturbed them. Victorian audiences were not prepared for a novel that refused to behave morally or emotionally. What unsettled them most was not the darkness itself, but the fact that the novel offered no clear instruction on how to judge it. Early critics described the book as coarse, brutal, and morally offensive. They expected novels to guide readers toward improvement, to reward virtue and punish wrongdoing. Wuthering Heights does neither. Cruelty is not neatly corrected. Suffering does not lead to wisdom. The story ends not with triumph but with emotional exhaustion. For Victorian readers, this absence of moral reassurance felt dangerous. Part of the shock came from the characters themselves. They are not polite, charming, or self-sacrificing. They act out of jealousy, resentment, pride, and obsession. Worse still, the novel asks readers to remain with them, to listen, to observe, and to understand without being told whom to forgive or condemn. This emotional neutrality was deeply unsettling in a culture that believed literature should reinforce social values. The reaction was even harsher because the novel was written by a woman. Female authors were expected to produce stories of domestic life, emotional refinement, and moral clarity. Instead, Emily Brontë presented rage, emotional violence, and moral ambiguity without apology. The intensity of feeling, especially from female characters, was considered unfeminine and improper. Critics questioned not just the book, but the mind that produced it. There was also discomfort with the novel's refusal to romanticize social institutions. Marriage does not heal, family does not protect, education does not civilize. These structures, which Victorian society relied upon for stability, are shown to be fragile and sometimes cruel. The novel suggests that respectability can coexist with emotional damage, an idea many readers preferred not to confront. What's telling is that much of the criticism focused on the novel's tone rather than its craft. Even its harshest reviewers acknowledged its power. The language was striking, the atmosphere was unforgettable, but power without moral direction was seen as a threat. The novel didn't tell readers what to think, it forced them to feel. Over time, this very quality became its greatest strength. As literary values shifted, Wuthering Heights was reevaluated not as a failure of morality, but as a radical psychological exploration. What once appeared savage began to look honest. What once felt excessive began to feel precise. The novel was no longer seen as immoral, but as unflinching. Today, the controversy surrounding Wuthering Heights is part of its legacy. The discomfort it produces is no longer a flaw, it is the point. The novel endures because it refuses simplification. It doesn't offer emotional safety or moral closure. It exposes the cost of repression, obsession, and unresolved trauma without softening the blow. And this is why the novel still divides readers. Some see beauty in its intensity, others see only cruelty. But no one walks away untouched. The shock that once outraged Victorian audiences continues to ripple forward, asking each generation the same unsettling question: what happens when literature tells the truth without asking permission? And that question brings us to the final movement of the novel, its legacy, its relevance, and why this story still refuses to fade. Even more than a century after its publication, Wuthering Heights refuses to feel distant. What unsettles modern readers is not the setting or the language, but how familiar the emotional patterns still are. Obsession, emotional dependency, generational trauma, and toxic relationships are not relics of the past. They are ongoing human experiences. In a culture that still romanticizes intensity, Wuthering Heights feels uncomfortably current. We continue to confuse chaos with passion, suffering with depth, and control with devotion. The novel strips these illusions bare. It shows what happens when love is defined by possession rather than care, not just in dramatic moments, but over years, across families, and through inherited damage. One of the novel's most lasting contributions is its portrayal of trauma as cyclical. Pain is passed down not because people are evil, but because they are unresolved. Children inherit emotional environments before they inherit choices. This idea, now central to modern psychology, was radical in Emily Brontë's time. The novel suggests that healing is not automatic. It requires interruption, awareness, and restraint. What ultimately breaks the cycle in Wuthering Heights is not intensity, but exhaustion. Obsession burns itself out. Revenge loses momentum. The surviving characters begin to choose stability, empathy, and mutual recognition, not because they are morally superior, but because they are willing to let go of the past. This quieter form of connection may lack drama, but it allows life to continue. The novel's legacy also lies in its refusal to comfort. Unlike traditional romances, it does not reassure the reader that love will save us. Instead, it asks us to examine how we love, why we attach, and what we expect another person to heal for us. It challenges the idea that suffering is proof of authenticity. Modern readers often feel divided by the novel because it doesn't tell us how to feel. Some are drawn to its intensity, others are repelled by its cruelty. That division is intentional. Wuthering Heights is not asking for admiration, it is asking for reflection. Its influence can be seen everywhere. In modern literature that explores damaged relationships without moral resolution, in films and series that center flawed, unlikable characters, and in cultural conversations about emotional toxicity and trauma. The novel paved the way for stories that prioritize psychological truth over emotional comfort. What makes Wuthering Heights endure is its honesty. It does not promise transformation through love. It shows that without self-awareness, love can become another form of harm. And in doing so, it offers something more valuable than romance: clarity. In the end, Wuthering Heights is not a story about finding love. It is a story about what happens when people demand from love what it cannot give: identity, salvation, and escape from the self. Its final message is quiet but firm: passion alone is not enough. Without growth, it only repeats itself. And that is why this novel still matters. Not because it is beautiful or tragic, but because it tells the truth and trusts the reader to face it.